in the software, in the Dramatica query system. If you've written already your storytelling question answer, that he wants to be president, then in the story forming question, there's a little bar of buttons along the Dramatica query system window that's the help you buttons, and one of them says storytelling, or illustration in some of the recent versions of the software. If you click on that button, it will bring up the words you've already used to illustrate that point. Then you can refer to them while making your structural choice, because you did your storytelling first. You weren't inhibited by even seeing those choices. You just said he wants to be president. That's his concern. Now you say, okay, does he want to obtain the office of the presidency, or does he want to become presidential? What's the issue here? In a story about Nixon, it might be wishing to obtain the office of the presidency. In a story about, like Dave, if you've ever seen the movie Dave, where the president is dying and eventually does die, and they need somebody to replace him, and when the president dies, this man off the street who did impersonations of the president suddenly has to try and rise to the office and become presidential. In Dave, wanting to be president means becoming. In Nixon, wanting to be president means winning the office. That's the difference. It gives a different feel, a different focus, depending on what the structure is underlying it. So if you try to write your story just by saying this guy wants to be president, you haven't made that decision. And that's why your story may suffer from a weak structure or an invisible structure, a nebulous structure where the audience really doesn't know what you're trying to say. By answering the storytelling questions first, you can then find the structure in your story, and then if you want, as a structuralist, you can go back and rework your storytelling, or if you want, once you've seen your structure and become familiar with it, as an inspirationist, you can go off and write a complete draft at that point, or a second draft, and then analyze it again, same way. It's important to recognize, though, that in the Dramatica software, it will try to lead you into doing a raw structure and then coming up with specific illustrations and then presenting them to your audience, figuring out how you're going to unfold them, and almost no one works that way. So my advice, don't follow the story guide path. My advice is, first, go into the storytelling in the Dramatica query system, answer those questions, find the structure by then going to the structural thing and referring to your own work, and at that point decide if you want to be a structuralist and then work out the rest of your story, or go off and write a draft as an inspirationist. The important thing in finding your structure also, one last point before we close for tonight. I know it's a long session, but I want to get all this information to you about story encoding. If you pick an item like he wants to be president, and then you've answered all these other questions in story encoding, once you've answered all the other questions in story encoding, don't just go through in order in the list when you try to find the structure. When you do go to the story forming questions to say, here's what I wrote, what is that structurally? Let me pick it. Here's something I wrote, let me pick what that is structurally. To find your structure, when you're doing that, don't just go in the order of questions. Pick the story point that's most important to you first. Because Dramatica's story engine is going to gray out future choices. It's going to limit them and narrow them down based on the choices that you make earlier on. So if you start making structural choices on things that are unimportant to you, by the time you get down to the ones that are important, you may not have the choice of any of the items that you want. And it may look like your most important storytelling that you've already done doesn't match anything appropriate structurally. And then you feel like your whole structure is kaput. Much better, first answer the storytelling, do as much as you can, go back and fill in others that you're inspired with, go to story structure, story forming, referring to those words that you wrote, but now, instead, go to the most important question to you, personally, as author. What story point is absolutely, this is one you want just the way you want it. Find that story point, look at your illustration, and pick the structural value that exactly matches it. For your first few choices, for your first few most important story points in order of priority, you'll get just what you want, because it will take several before you reach something that may not be in line what you'd like to have. Now you may be lucky and everything will be able to fit with your storytelling, that you actually have a good sound structure and maybe you only have to fill in a few other ones. Once you find your structure, you can see structurally what must be there, and then at that point you can go ahead and fill it in without any problem because you know what's supposed to be in there. But eventually you may come to something that all of the choices do not match what you did. Since it is now a less important story point, at that point in your process of creating your story, you may just decide to go back and revise what you wrote in your illustrations. And when you do that, you brought your story in line with the structure. Or you may decide it's actually a minor structural point, not just to me, but in the overall structure. It doesn't have a lot of impact on everything. It's an insignificant story point. And in that case, then all you need to do is ignore it. Break structure and go with your storytelling. Because it may be that on minor structural story points, you get so excited about something that you know you can tell it well and it's close to what should be structurally proper, or it's not close, but it's not important, and it would be such an entertaining thing to do that the benefit you get by keeping your audience locked into your story and exciting them, and the benefit you get by being inspired because you're excited yourself, far outweighs the small amount of structural damage you do. So go ahead and break the structure as long as it's not a fatal flaw. So to conclude, we've now looked at story encoding. We've described what it is. It is a way of taking a raw structure and either turning it into specific real people, places, and events that occur in your story. Or it's a way of jotting down first the people, places, and events and subject matter you'd like to deal with in your story, and then finding and refining the structure in it. We've shown some illustrations from The Fugitive. We've also talked about in the Dramatica software to ignore the way it tells you to start. It says start here, and it puts you right into the beginning of the story guide path. I pretty much recommend, I wrote that path, and I recommend not using it, because after I wrote it, it's the perfect path logistically to go from structure to encoding, from story forming to story encoding, to story weaving, to story reception. It just follows through perfectly. Only problem is, although that's theoretically the best way to go, it's not a very human way to go. So instead, go to the storytelling questions first in the Dramatica query system, fill in your information, use that to generate ideas, then go to the structure and answer structural questions beginning with the most important story points to you until you filled in as many as you can. And then the structure will eventually become a complete story form after you've answered enough questions, and it will suggest the kinds of story point items that need to be in there. You can compare it to the words you've done and see if they fit with what you've written, then either alter what you've written or just go ahead and ignore it and say it's not an important structural point and do it the way you'd rather do it, because sure, the structure is a little weaker, but the storytelling is much stronger. That's about it. We finished encoding in one class rather than in two parts for a change. Next week, let me see, we did encoding, we got plot. Plot is next week. So we'll be dealing with plot in two parts. Part 1, followed by, wait for it, Part 2. In plot, we're going to look at all of the structural plot items, the static plot points, and then in Part 2, we're going to be looking at the act order and scene order progression and show you in more detail how to create 28 scenes in plot that accommodate all of the needs to develop all of the plot events in all 4 through lines of your story. That's it for now. Again, thank you for being with me with Dramatica Unplugged, and until we meet again with our next class, best wishes for all your writing endeavors.